Hi everyone. So we're live today because I had to cancel our 12:15 interspiritual service on the multifaceted face of God lesson on type 6 on the Enneagram. I am offering this live Q&A session on spiritual principles, unity principles, and the Enneagram. And I encourage you to let your friends know about this. I can't promise I'll answer all your questions, but I do have questions that have already been pre-submitted that I will begin with. So welcome everyone. I hope you're enjoying this from the warmth of your own home and staying safe and not trying to venture out into this icy, snowy weather. So let's begin. And feel free if you are just finding out about this right now. I only decided this morning to do it. Feel free to pose questions in the live feed. This is the first time I've ever tried doing a Q&A live, so we'll see how this works. But again, I'll start with some questions that have already been submitted to me via Facebook Messenger this morning. So the first question is, do you think an interest in the Enneagram can lead to an interest in furthering personal development? That's an interesting question because I would think it would be reversed. That generally what I find is that people who are very interested in personal/spiritual development are very drawn to the Enneagram because the Enneagram can deeply support that process. I don't find many people who just find the Enneagram an interesting sort of system and then later, because of that, come to desire more personal growth, if you will. So I think it's actually more the reverse. So that's the first question. And feel free to ask follow-up questions. Let's see here. How does a contemplative practice such as centering prayer help us to progress in our psycho-spiritual development? So that's a great question. I think that contemplative practice, well, I have found in my personal experience and in witnessing the journeys of people with whom I work either individually or in groups, that contemplative practice, the marriage of contemplative practices with the Enneagram is one of the most powerful tools for both personal growth and spiritual development. And the reason for this is I want to first explain sort of the way I hold the Enneagram system. The idea is that generally I believe that most of us don't operate from our true or essential nature. That from the beginning of our lives, we start to develop habituated patterns of acting and feeling in the world and that are in response to our early childhood experiences, if you will. And I'll speak in a moment about whether I believe that it's a nature or nurture issue, like how we come into this world in terms of our Enneagram type. So what happens is over time, those patterns become so ingrained in us, they become our identity, and we start to believe that we are this particular personality, if you will. And for me, the Enneagram isn't about naming, like your Enneagram personality type isn't about naming who you are in truth. It's actually about identifying what your false self system is, like the particular ego that you constructed, with which you are over-identified. And so contemplative practice for me is a journey and a methodology and a devotional practice of actually repeatedly dying to that false self, dying to our belief that that is who we are, so that, like most of us, I find, generally operate in a day-to-day way, in a way that, sure, helps us to move towards our goals, but there are ways in which we get stuck and have these sort of limiting patterns that we can't seem to get out of. To me, those are patterns that are based on our personality type. So contemplative practice, sort of as a practice of dying to yourself on a daily basis through this sort of meditative journey, is a way in which we surrender that false self. We surrender, to put it more precisely, we surrender the belief that we are that. And by doing so, we open to this more core aspect of who we are and allow that to kind of shine and express itself, so that we are more freed of the habits of our particular type. And so the idea is that most of us, though, in the beginning of the journey, we tend to believe, oh, this is just who I am. You know, this is how I act. And people around us can tend to be frustrated that there's just really a limited, predictable way in which we respond to everyday events in the world. So for me, the value of contemplative practice is it begins to free us from the compulsions of our type and allow us to access what we call like all the points of the Enneagram, the wholeness of what is represented by the circle of the Enneagram. The idea is not that we become everything, it's that we have access to the skills and gifts of every point on the Enneagram. And we're freed from the compulsions of that little one dot with which we are habitually identified. So I hope that makes sense. Please raise your hand or send me a heart if that did make sense. And if you have an additional follow-up question, please do ask that so I know that I'm being heard or understood. Hi, Tom. Hi, John. Hi, Penny, Patrick, Andrew, Kathy, Amanda, Sarah, and who else is on here? Terry. There's a question. I'll jump because these are more advanced questions from one of our advanced practitioners. I'll jump to a question from Chris from a beginner. How is an Enneagram different than a personality test? Wow. Okay. So I'll begin by describing what I believe the Enneagram actually is. So for me, the Enneagram is a map of consciousness. And I, from a unity perspective, believe that life is consciousness, that everything that is sourced from this sort of universal intelligence that some of us call God, some of us call divine mind. So the idea is that it's not just about our personalities, but our personality is one aspect of consciousness. So for me, the Enneagram is much bigger than that. It's much more holistic in its approach to growth because it's a map of, in a way, the world, not just of personality. So the Enneagram of personality is actually just one type of Enneagram, the one that's most popularized in our modern day, because in some ways it's the most accessible. So the Enneagram became popularized mainly through spiritual directors and therapists who are using it in their counseling work. And so again, the emphasis is on the personality, but remembering that, especially from the perspective from which I teach it, the idea is if you look at the Enneagram and you look at the 9 points, your personality, your false self, is that little dot with which you're identified, right? Your type. Like, for instance, if you're a type 7 on the Enneagram, you're most identified with that type. I'm a type 1 on the Enneagram. The beauty of the Enneagram is that identifying your personality type is really just the beginning of the journey. By identifying your personality type, you start to recognize behaviors, like you might read about behaviors that are common to people within your personality type. And you might actually begin to gain self-awareness, like, oh, that's right, I do that. I didn't realize I did, but because I read this, it sort of like woke up this part of me that's like, that's exactly what I do. Like for me as a 1, I did not realize exactly how self-critical I was until I read about it and realized, oh, wait a minute, not everyone does this. Like to me, that was such the norm that I just assumed that's a base level of operating in the world, that's not actually a hypercritical way of operating in the world. And so by reading about my type in comparison to other types and realizing, no, that's not the framework from which everyone sees the world, that's the beginning of awakening. Now, the beauty of the Enneagram is that if you look at the shape, your number also has like 2 lines. One line moves toward what is historically called the direction of integration. My 1 touches on 7. That's the direction of integration for the 1. And then the other line goes to what is called the direction of disintegration. Now, in modern day, I know this is getting a little bit complex, but in modern day, Enneagram teachers are really reformulating what that means, because it's not as simple as you integrate toward one and then you disintegrate toward the other. But under stress, I'm more likely to move toward type 4, if you look at the Enneagram. And under feelings of safety, etc., I'm more likely to move toward the point 7, which is the Epicurean. I become more spontaneous, playful, and less serious as a 1. And so I can tap into both types, you know, sort of as a way of discharging excess stress or energy, if you will. And so recognizing my movement is also a way in which I can gain awareness of whether or not I am grounded. And so when I watch myself tap into one or other point, I can recognize that likely, okay, when I'm under stress, I'm going to become an unhealthy type 1. But when I'm really under stress, I see how I move toward the 4's envy and longing and comparing myself to other people, even a sort of depressive melancholy. When I see that behavior, that's going to clue me into the fact that I need to do more spiritual grounding. I need to find something within myself, which I generally source through prayer and meditation. Predominantly for me, my meditation method is centering prayer. So the complexity of the Enneagram is so much greater than that of just a mere personality test. This is just one example. You go even deeper and you say there's the Enneagram. I'm doing a lesson series Sundays at 12:15 on the holy ideas. So the Enneagram of holy ideas paints this picture of, okay, if life is consciousness, then you can consider that there are like 9 different faces of that truth. And so the holy ideas are like facets of reality with a capital R. And one teaching on the Enneagram says that each of our personality types developed as a compensatory method in response to having lost sight, having lost awareness of one of those faces of reality, what I call one of those faces of God. Like, so imagine for me as a 1, I lost sight of the face of holy perfection, this deep knowing that everything is perfect exactly as it is and that I am whole and perfect exactly as I am. And having lost sight of that, you know, the ego that believes it's separate from that truth and separate from sort of this innate sense of perfection, then compulsively looks at what's wrong in me and in others. Why? So I can fix it, so I can perfect what doesn't seem to be perfect. And then what happens is my whole life, unconsciously before I learned the Enneagram, is devoted to scanning a room, looking for what's wrong, which is no fun for anybody, especially the people I date, right? Like, and endeavoring to fix it. So the hyper focus on what's wrong with the situation so that I could perfect it or fix it actually limits my capacity to show up in a more present way to totality as it is. And so recognizing that the source of my type 1-ness is actually deeper than, oh, this is who I am, this is my personality, but that the personality itself originated from this false belief that there isn't already an intrinsic wholeness and perfection to what already is. And so through my prayer life, the idea is reinforcing the knowing of that through, again, centering prayer and also through unity affirmative prayer, you know, claiming the perfection of things so that it's like my system can remember something that is already fundamentally and essentially true. And then guess what? I start to live from that truth more fully as a result. And sure, that doesn't mean I stop caring about the world, but then my caring doesn't come from you're broken and I'm going to fix you. It's instead, you're intrinsically whole. You know, in my ministry, there's a perspective. You're now, you know, intrinsically whole, and it's my work to support you in recognizing that. That's fundamentally different from, oh, you're broken and I can help you and I can fix you. So that's just one example of how much deeper the Enneagram is than any mere personality type typing system. So I hope that answers your questions, Chris. Let me know. So let's see what else. Oh, what practices have you and others used the Enneagram to get in touch with a higher power? willpower. I'm going to beat this. I'm going to repeat this over and over again because I'm deeply passionate about this. But for me, no practice other than centering prayer has been better. Why? Because centering prayer is at root a practice of surrender. And for most of us in our modern day, we want to be in control of our lives. Like the personal growth perspective is all about, these are the things that I want to accomplish. These are the ways in which I want to improve myself. And then I, through my own willpower, am going to effort towards that. And since I spent, probably the first 30 years of my life endeavoring through self-help books to pull myself up from my own bootstraps and being very ineffective in it, I realized that that methodology wasn't going to work. It's kind of like Einstein's famous quote, no problem can be solved at the same level of consciousness that created it. And for me, trying to fix things to improve myself using only sort of my own intellect and my own willpower never served to kind of enable me to transcend my limiting patterns, the ways in which I continually sabotaged myself, the spirals of thinking and of beating myself up that I used to go through. Learning through psychology about myself wasn't fixing it. So tapping into this higher power was really about surrendering to a mystery, surrendering to a wisdom bigger than me. And it doesn't have to be God in the traditional term. In fact, God for me isn't some, man in the sky, but instead is this sort of universal intelligence, a consciousness greater than my present one of which I am an integral part. But if I'm identified with my ego or my personality, I'm already coming from a stance in which I don't know my oneness with that. And so the act of prayer for me, the act of meditation, is the movement toward remembering that. And that remembering demands that I surrender what I think I know, because otherwise I'm still operating off of my present consciousness. So the power of any practice in which we submit ourselves to a power greater than ourselves is, to me, one of the most transformative ways that we can use the Enneagram. And I see that every day. I lead two different groups, a Tuesday and Thursday group, where people who are Enneagram literate actually practice together in community this act of dying to our old self. And the Enneagram literacy among the group also supports us in having greater compassion for how, oh my goodness, I'm not a type 2, but because I understand how a type 2 can get lost in the pride of knowing what everybody wants or thinking they do, and then giving it to them before the other person even asks, and obsessively being focused on other people's needs before their own. Like when I watch that, and I watch the 2 start to make the move toward owning what he or she really wants, I can see how, with compassion, how shame comes up for that type in a way that it probably wouldn't for me. But because that's the core issue of the type, the vice of pride and the belief that their own needs are not valuable, then as a group, as a community, we can hold space for how that particular type, the type 2, is gonna swing on the pendulum the other way and start to over-assert, if you will. So, suddenly now 2 doesn't want to do anything that they were doing before to help people, because they're trying to find their own themselves. They're trying to find, like, what is it that I want and need? And I can't do that in relation to others, because the 2 is so relational. So it's so automatic to start thinking about the other person's needs, right? Chris Heuertz, in his amazing book, The Sacred Enneagram, actually sets forth a slew of amazing contemplative practices that can be used, and contemplative postures, etc., that can be used depending on your Enneagram type. So for the 2 is in the image corner of the Enneagram, 2, 3s, and 4s are, he recommends solitude. And it makes total sense. Being deeply relational, the 2 needs to have a space where there's no one reflecting back, through their approval or through their appreciation, who the 2 is. So in that vacuum of reflection, the Enneagram Type 2 person is forced to discern and discover from within who they are. And that's such a powerful journey. But it doesn't happen readily. Each of our egos wants to maintain control and say, hey, stick with me, my methodology is going to work for you, but it doesn't. It never does. A Course in Miracles, I love to quote A Course in Miracles, always says the ego's mantra is seek, but do not find. That's what every Enneagram type does. Having lost sight of the basic holy idea, it develops a personality construct that's designed to try to get in the world what it thinks it's missing. The problem is it's not actually missing it, but it keeps looking in the world via other people, via security, via perfecting, via adventures and play and pleasure to try to fill this need, when the only way it can actually be filled is from within. Going into the silence, going into stillness, going into the practice of solitude. Those are all valuable for every type, and certain ones are particularly valuable for different types. And yeah, so I highly recommend Chris's book, The Sacred Enneagram, because it really can outline for you a path of transformation. Again, recognizing that the Enneagram is a map of consciousness. So I hope I answered that question for you, Sarah. Let's see. What other questions? Hey, Jody. Hey, Bill and Janelle. Oh, where can we find Enneagram tests or more information about this? I decided to put it on the You Thrive website. That's www. The letter U, thrive, at unity.com, some Enneagram information. And so I've actually linked some of the sites from the Enneagram Institute, the Ready test, and among other tests that you can take. So I will actually post a link after this Facebook Live video, and you can click on that and find out more about discerning your type. If you're that new to the Enneagram, remember, discovering your type is just the beginning. Don't get stuck there. It's exciting when we first discover our type, but really it is a beginning, not for going around typing everyone like it's some parlor trick, but really about coming to a deeper awareness of the things that were previously invisible to you that you would do that actually tend to sabotage the peace and the love that you actually want in life. So the Enneagram is such a powerful tool for that. Okay, what else? Oh, do I have any classes coming up on the Enneagram? Thanks for that question. I do, actually. And even though the CPE groups are ongoing right now, they're more advanced classes. So every time, every quarter or so, I try to create more introductory classes. December 10th, I have a class on conscious relationships and the Enneagram. That's in the evening, 6:30 to 9 o'clock. And I've designed that class so that folks who don't even know their Enneagram type can even still get something out of it. We'll talk about Hornevian groups and harmonic groups, the ways that different personality types handle conflict, the social styles of different types, object relations for the different types. So even if you don't know your type, you might even begin to learn your type by understanding which of those categories you fall into. Here's just a quick example. The 4 on the Enneagram, in terms of a conflict style, is what's called an emotional realness type. It used to be called emotional reactivity. 8s and 6s are also in that category. When you recognize that there is this category for dealing with conflict called emotional realness, and you recognize that there are 2 other main ones. One is positive outlook, and one is rational competency. So imagine that in the world, everyone has access to all 3 methods of dealing with conflict, but we tend to default toward one. We prioritize it. We think it's really the best way. And so what happens when a problem occurs And it's not just the problem, right? It's not just that someone cut us off on the road, but it's that I am reacting to being cut off differently from how my partner reacts to being cut off. You know, so in a classic example, if someone's an emotional realness type, they're going to have an emotional reaction to it. And if someone's a positive outlook type, they might be like, well, I'm sure they didn't see where they were going, really trying to positively frame it so the upset isn't there. Now, the person who's experiencing the upset, if you've ever been in this kind of situation, usually discounting their feelings actually exacerbates the situation, right? So you got what initially happened, and then now you have a conflict between you two because one person is like, well, I'm upset, and the other person's like, don't be upset. When you recognize that someone's an emotional realness type, and you have the wherewithal, even if you're not, to be grounded enough to honor that, hey, before this person can move on and even look at the positive side of things, they have to first have their feelings be validated and honored. You know, that doesn't mean you have to agree with the extent of reaction. It's really just about honoring what that person experienced and just recognizing it and saying, yeah, you know, like that was scary. Yeah, that was scary. And oftentimes what happens is the person who's the emotional realness type can then move on. But when you don't do that, they can often escalate. And then even to a point where they're trying to get you to feel the upset so that their upset can be validated, and now you're both upset. So now just even knowing and understanding that, you can begin by getting grounded. And if both parties know, then like, let's say you're the emotional realness type, then you might have the wherewithal in that moment to go, okay, my partner is not just discounting and invalidating my feelings. He's going to orient toward being a positive outlook. So maybe I can be grounded enough in this moment to honor that and say, hey, yeah, that could be the case, you know, and so, but that doesn't, you know, change that. That was really scary for me. And so that's a different conversation, right, than two people dishonoring their respective differences and their approaches to a conflict or problem that arises in a relationship. So that's just one of the types of things that we'll be studying in the December 10th Conscious Relationship Skills class. And again, that's 6:30 to 9 p.m. And it's going to be an interactive class, so you can bring, you know, your real life questions to that. I'm very pragmatic. Like, I want to make sure these aren't just abstract teachings, but they can be really lived out in your life in a way that brings you greater peace, love, and joy in your life. So thanks for that. Oh, and I have also, there is a more advanced, this is for those of you who already know your Enneagram type and already have a meditation practice, ideally centering prayer, but not necessarily, as long as you can sit for 20 minutes. On December 15th, Saturday, I think I have a retreat scheduled from like 9:30 to 2:30, and these are some of my more advanced students who are coming who want to go deeper in healing some of their like core wounds and in freeing themselves. You know, again, by freedom, what I mean is don't get stuck on that dot on the Enneagram. You have access to the skills and aptitudes of any of the Enneagram points. You know, you have access to assertiveness, you have access to groundedness. And so this retreat will be sort of like a meditation retreat. We'll do some processes, and it will be limited to 20 people. And I think we have like about 18 signed up. So there are only a couple spaces left for that. And I think the fee for the whole day is like $75. So it's very reasonable. And so that will be about your individual journey of awakening to a greater knowing of your own wholeness. So December 15th, Saturday. So that's my other class. Thank you for that question. I'll go love the question on Facebook. I love that one too. So what other questions? Aw, you're too, Jamie, in that solitude space. That's awesome. So we have a 2 here sharing about how, kind of in response, if you just came on, I talked a little earlier about how in Chris Hewitt's book, The Sacred Enneagram, he recommends solitude for the type 2 because the type 2 is so relational, it can't even begin to know what it needs. You can't even begin to know what you need when you stay in relationship to others. And so the stretch that the 2 takes to spend time in solitude when you're probably going to feel super guilty, right? And selfish, even, that's a word that like the worst word for 2 is like to feel like I'm selfish rather than giving and generous. So yeah, but just have to remember that people won't forget me. Aw, so Jamie shared so beautifully here. I'm a 2, totally in that solitude space right now. It's a struggle because I'm so social, but I just have to remember that people won't forget me. And I want to add to that, Jamie, that in one respect, I think the practice of solitude is the practice of recognizing the ways in which you forgot yourself in how you have been attending to others. And as you remember yourself more fully, I think that starts to get mirrored back in the people who are drawn to you. So you're going to draw to you less and less people who only come because they need you. And so your relationships will have increased mutuality and equality and in partnership and in that give and take that is uncomfortable, because there's a part of you that deeply believes if I don't give more, people will leave. And so that's a huge stretch, and I just really commend you for dedicating yourself to that practice of solitude, which is, again, important for all of us, especially important for types 2, 3, and 4. So, hi, Tim. Hi, Alicia. Oh, thanks for posting. So Chris has already posted the Youth Thrive link. Thank you so much, Paul, Nikum, Valerie. Let's see what other questions. Yes, I'm still planning on teaching an online course, and my intro course is available right now. And I'll post a link to that through Unity Worldwide Spiritual Institute. And the Conscious Relationships online class won't be available till January, but you could actually register for it now. So I'll like the question after I read. Where can we learn about centering prayer? Any resources you recommend? I'm going to add some to my website too. The book that I use in class for CPE is Cynthia Bourgeau's Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening. And again, Chris's book, The Sacred Enneagram, also talks about the process. So those are the 2 recommended readings for my CPE group. And let me reiterate what CPE stands for: Contemplative Practices and the Enneagram Practice Groups. Again, recognizing that people love to study and learn about the Enneagram, but until you actually put it into practice, incorporate spiritual practice, I just haven't seen stuff budge for people. You know, it just becomes this the mental gymnastics and intellectual exercise, but it really doesn't shift until we deeply engage the practice in a dedicated way. I want to add, regarding centering prayer, for those of you who are considering it now, that the recommendation is that you do 2 sits, 20 minutes apiece, for 6 months before you decide that it's not for you. The other piece about it is it's very unlike other practices. Like, for instance, the common example I use is sometimes I'm seeking guidance. So I might do a guided meditation seeking wisdom. So I'm looking for insight during my meditation. Centering prayer is very different from that. It's an act of surrender. It's an act of surrendering everything I think I want, you know, and so it's really an exercise of letting go of self in a profound way. And when things arise, even if it seems like this valuable insight arises in the silence, I'm supposed to even let that go. I'm supposed to focus on my sacred word and even let that idea move and shift away, because that's what my ego thought it needed. So it's an act of continually returning to this emptiness, so that something within that mystery, that higher consciousness, can teach me who I really am. And they say the fruits of the practice are not in the practice. So it's not the insight or the peace I gain during my sit. The fruits of the practice are not in the practice, but in our lives. Somehow, weeks down the road, I find that the same thing happened, but I didn't react in the same way. And then I realize I'm freer than I used to be. That's the power of centering prayer. So, next question. Oh, can you talk more about centering prayer? I think I have already, Sarah, but if you have a more specific question, please feel free to ask that. Hi, Macarena. Nature versus nurture question. In your opinion, are we born with an innate type? Is it reaction to environment, or is it a mixture of both? Thanks, Will. Actually, that was one of the questions that was sent to me earlier. And I believe that many of the modern Enneagram teachers share this perspective. because I have a spiritual foundation and belief system, if you don't, that this might not resonate for you, but I deeply believe that we come into this life with a soul level orientation, and that we interpret all of our early childhood experiences through the lens of the holy idea, as I shared earlier, that we lost sight of. And so in that sense, I believe it's nature and not nurture, And so, but what happens is, I think in early life, so if your filter is already this, if my filter is already, the world is imperfect, I'm imperfect, everything needs to be fixed and changed, then as soon as I encounter not getting my needs met, which every child encounters that experience, right? Then I'm inevitably going to interpret that as, see, the world's not perfect, or I'm not good enough, and that's why my needs aren't going to get met. But if I improve myself, if I become a better person, then maybe people will love me and my needs will get met. And so, yeah, I personally deeply believe that we come into the world that way. And I'm in a family of 5 kids, and we are all so different despite seemingly very similar upbringings, right? We reacted to the same upbringing in a very different way. The beauty of this, though, is that, people, I'm a philosophy major. I studied philosophy in college. People can debate the nature and nurture question all they want. To me, it doesn't get us anywhere to answer that question. I'm more interested in knowing, where am I today, and what methodologies or practice can help me to free myself from the ways in which I keep myself and others around me, from peace, love, and joy, if you will. So again, very pragmatic. Doesn't matter what the answer to the question is. Where we find ourselves today and what we do with that, to me, is a more relevant question, a living question to be asked. Hey, Billy. Can you talk a bit more about moving towards healthier patterns of behavior once your type has been identified? I'm a little confused as a type 3. Should I be working on developing more balanced 3 traits, or looking to emulate type 6's, which is 3's path of integration? That is a great question. So I'll start by saying that my understanding of the Enneagram, again, and teachers might differ on this, is that when you do your spiritual practice, the traits of your integration point, the strengths of it, spontaneously emerge. So you're not trying, like in old religion, in theology, where it's like you read about what you should be, and then you try to embody or emulate those traits. Rather, looking at the Enneagram as a map of consciousness, the way I approach it is, I notice that as I do my inner work of healing from the inside out, the spontaneity and playfulness of the 7, which is my integration point, naturally emerges. And for you as a type 3, which is historically, compulsively competitive, right? Being the best, being the top, being noticed for that, and believing that your identity and your worth are intimately linked to that. That when you start to dig in and do your solitude, as is the practice for the 3, and really come into an inner knowing of your worth, then some of the best qualities of the type 6, your integration point, start to emerge, which is you become more cooperative. You want to work as a team. You don't want to be the best. You want to work together. That relationship becomes, traditionally a 3 will be like, oh, goals over people. And the move towards 6 that becomes spontaneous is more like, oh, people matter. And related to that, it's that I matter. Because I think deep in the 3's psyche is this idea that, yeah, a 3 can kind of use people to get their goals done, but it's also that they use themselves. They see themselves as tools to get goals done in order to somehow get love on the other side of it, right? And so we don't judge the 3 for having a utility approach to other people. They have that utilitarian approach to themselves, sadly, until they start, as you have been, to wake up. So, great question again, Billy. Who else? What questions am I missing? Okay, I have a gazillion questions that were sent to me here. What time is it? 40 minutes, wow. Okay. Do you think we can discuss how our wings might be influenced by our dominant or blind subtypes? Or is that too complex? Thanks for honoring that. That's a pretty complex question to answer something like this. So I have a non-statistically verified, but observation based on the numerous people who I've been working with very intimately on this. So for those who are new, I want to just briefly explain this. So on the Enneagram, you have your personality type, your core type. And again, the belief is that you never change your core type. We tap into qualities of other types around the Enneagram, but we don't actually change our core type. Now, next to your type on that circle, you have two different numbers, right? As a 1, I have a possible 9-wing or a 2-wing. Different traditions differ in that some people say, you just tap into either wing, but some traditions say that you have a dominant wing. I tend to lean towards, well, I'm open on this. Like, I don't think it's deeply relevant to know, but I tend to lean towards you have a dominant wing. I'm a 1 with a 2-wing. So this question relates to, oh, I just lost the question. I think I will remember it though. It basically relates to the idea that, okay, now I have to describe instinctual variance. So within the Enneagram system, I would say in the last decade, the discussion about subtypes and instinctual variance has become much more popular. And I'm really excited about that because to me, this is almost even better than learning about your Enneagram type, your core type. So there are 3 sort of basic survival instincts. One is self-preservation, one is social, and one is sexual. Again, this is a very brief tutorial. Hopefully you will hear about this and get excited and do further research or come to classes, because this is really not enough if you're brand new to this. But so you have your number, but within your number, you have, so we all have all 3 instincts, for survival, because self-preservation is things like, being focused on finances and being focused on food and shelter, basic self-preservation. The second is social. So this is our bonding instinct. And we know that when we ally in groups and in community, we're more likely to survive. So it's another basic survival instinct. And then the sexual instinct is our instinct in some ways, you could say, to extend ourselves into the future. So the sexual instinct is about procreation. It is about sex, but it's not only about sex. It's also about intensity. It's about expansion. So whereas the self-preservation energy is primarily about conservation, it's holding within, I would say that the social energy feels more like gathering of community and connectedness, in a lateral way, and this sexual energy can also be like a passion for spirituality. It's a moving upward. It's that expansive energy. So we have all 3, but there's a teaching around the idea that we stack them. So we have a dominant. My dominant is sexual, passionate, intense. My second is social, community-oriented. And my last one, everybody jokes, I joke about it all the time, is self-preservation. That's my blind spot. So even though I have the need for food, shelter, etc., I'm more likely than most to forget to eat. I'm more likely than most to neglect that aspect of myself because it's not on my radar. My dominant is that of intensity, that of growth, that of expansion, passion, the sexual subtype. So going back to the question that was asked, the question is, so as a type 1, which is a sexual dominant, I will focus my hypercriticalness generally on my partner, on that relationship. Like I become more obsessed with that particular area of life. And so the question is, how does that play out in wings? I definitely see that I have a 2-wing. And so when I read about what a 2 sexual subtype looks like, I see how my oneness is flavored in that. you know, so that even the twos hyper-focus on being needed by their particular special somebody is an orientation that I have. And I've witnessed it in people too, like in my congregants, in my students, where it really appears that, like, for instance, I know a 7 is a sexual subtype. And this person seems to exhibit like what looks like counterphobic, appears to have a 6 wing and seems to exhibit counterphobic 6 aspects. And for me, that just sort of validates the, oh, well, of course, going into the wing, you're going to go into the dominant subtype of the 6 too, you know, which is the sexual subtype. And for a 6, that looks like daredevil types of activities. And so this would be a 7 who's all about adventure, but it's not just about adventure. It's also about being a little bit of a daredevil in his adventures. So that's just one example. I see it very often among my students who are Enneagram literate and who are self-aware enough to report in ways that seem to validate this. I want to say that the difference between our stacking and our number is that there's at least a belief that, you know, our stacking can possibly change throughout our lifetime, even though our core Enneagram number cannot. And I don't have enough information to like validate that, whether that's true, whether we truly shift. But I do know that recognizing your dominant and especially recognizing your blind spot, like it's almost less important to know what your which your top one is than what your blind spot is. That people like Michael Naylor have done some great work around helping people in recovery and addiction, recognizing that their top is usually compulsive, addictively acted out, and then the blind spot, when it's consciously cultivated, can actually support the system in a way that enables that compulsive acting out of the dominant instinct, not so compulsive. And so again, Michael Naylor, I think, is really good on exploring that with people right now. And that's Naylor is his last name. So Terry, hi Terry, hi Holly, asked a question. She's a type 2. When we are practicing our solitude and we are social or sexual, how do we avoid depression? Hard to balance. Now, I want to make clear in answering this that I am not a trained like psychotherapist, and so I'm not equipped to answer things about like clinical depression. And so I would really recommend that if you feel that that's an issue for you, that you go to someone specifically trained to address that. So I want to start with that and then move into saying that if it's just regular depression, like dealing with feelings of sadness as a result of facing yourself, that I wouldn't avoid it, that I would strike a balance of staying connected to either community or at minimum a person like a spiritual director or counselor who will keep you accountable to showing up and not sort of moving into the listlessness or apathy that depression or sadness can bring. So developing that relationship is sort of essential, because, you know, practicing solitude doesn't mean you don't go and talk to anybody. It's really about creating distance specifically from the people that you as a type 2 are most likely to fall into the trap of helping, if you will. So if you are a sexual subtype and your two-ness has related primarily to spouse and children, for instance, the solitude is not from all people. It's, I mean, that can be part of it, but staying in community with people who are supporting you and taking space from those people can be very important. And then balanced with maybe bookend check-ins with a spiritual counselor or your community when you say, hey, I'm going to venture and do even a half-day solitary retreat, which feels really freaky to me because I've never been alone like that. And so by having the people who care about you, who will check in on you, who will draw you out, that can help offset. But it's very important that you not just dive into, okay, well, I'm a 2 and now I'm just going to be completely alone. In fact, the 2 needs to learn how to rely on others and lean into that and receive from others. So part of the healing path is about not necessarily compulsively giving, but really leaning into community or individual therapist or counselor to find support. So thank you, Terry, for that great question. Thanks, Marcy. And who else? Does anyone have questions? Did I miss anything? If I missed anything earlier that you asked, if you could ask it again, that would be great. I see Andrew on here also. And what time is it? 50 minutes. You got 9 more minutes to ask me questions. And I'll see if I can dig out this list of questions that was asked earlier. Oh, here we go. Okay, the set at birth question already answered. How do our dominant subtypes affect our primary relationships? Can you give a few examples? Okay, so I just did a teaching on the 3 instincts and how we kind of have a stacking. We have a dominant, which we can tend to go to compulsively. We tend to over-prioritize it. We have a middle, which is something we generally do in a balanced way, and we have a blind spot, one that we could really use active cultivation in. But even apart from that, while we're still there in the stacking, we're going to encounter people with different stackings. And the idea is some of the most challenging relationship that we can be in isn't necessarily people of a different Enneagram type, but what I've seen is that the most challenging relationship is actually when your dominant is in your partner or significant person in your life, maybe mother, parent, etc.'s blind spot. So the area that they will be most inclined to discount is the area that matters the most to you. That is the most challenging relationship to navigate, because that part is so unconscious, like the need for that is so unconscious in the other person, and it is so primary in you. Now, if both partners are on a path of growth, nothing's fatal. If both partners are on a path of growth, they're integrating within their subtype stacking such that they're more balanced, then you can find a middle ground. So the person whose blind spot is, say, self-preservation, which is like mine, like let's say my partner's dominant is self-preservation. Well, if in the beginning I'm like, really, like, why do you need this? Like, it really just doesn't feel important. But if I'm cultivating it in myself actively, that's going to support me in honoring it in my loved one. And so again, another amazing piece about the Enneagram, how seeing this map of consciousness can help us move in a direction to find more wholeness. Again, not from the perspective that there's anything broken or wrong with us, but it's from the perspective of there's a totality of juicy life that we can experience if we're not sort of tied to our way of thinking and being in the world. So yeah, and so really the work is in honoring, understanding subtypes in relationships helps us to be invited, right? Because a lot of times if you have the exact same stacking as your partner, there's an initial advantage to that where, like, oh my gosh, it feels like you care about all the same things I care about, and that's great. But like, if self-preservation is both of your blind spots, you might have trouble paying the bills because both of you have neglected them. And so having awareness in relationship is so invaluable for going, oh, we actually now have to consciously both be cultivating that, because neither of us is going to really push the other to cultivate it. On the other hand, if your partner, has as his highest or her highest something that is low on you, your love for that person can drive and draw you to integrate that piece more in yourself, so out of love. And so that's part of the beauty of the Enneagram, of like kind of recognizing, oh yeah, now I get why that's valuable. And now I get why that person cares so much about that. And I get why I don't. So more compassion with each other for sure. And understanding. Teresa, Amanda, hey. Okay, what other questions? Social is my blind spot, and I find the Enneagram to be a wonderful tool for more successfully engaging in community. Yay, Maka. Do you have tips for how best to use Enneagram in our daily lives and organizations? Okay, well, yes, engaging in community. So my tips for using the Enneagram in our daily lives is that whenever we start to learn the Enneagram, most of us fall into the trap of going, oh, of course they do that. They're that type, you know? And then in a way we start to do exactly what the Enneagram is not intended to do, which is to then put people in a box. Like that's you. The whole idea is more to have compassion, to go, oh, because that person is a fear-based type, 5, 6, or 7, I'm not. So I'm not as in touch with my fear. So I might not normally be as sensitive to things that bring up, you know, like things like change. I'm not as naturally sensitive to change. But if I understand that someone in my community is a 6 and tends to have as a first reaction an aversion to change, then I can manage implementation of change in a more compassionate and patient way. And so to me, that is one of the highest uses of the Enneagram from a purely psychological level. That's not even about personal transformation, which I've talked a lot about in the beginning of this video. But so the beauty is really to not brand someone something in a way that locks them down, but to be aware of how for that type, that particular issue is going to be more alive. And so I'm going to actually be more sensitive to it. And then I can be relational. And then I can, in community, work together more collaboratively. And even as a practical matter, even if you're not talking love and compassion, more stuff gets done when you honor each person's process and you honor the different types' needs. You know, and in a group, you're going to know that the 8 is going to be impatient and just wants you to freaking get it done. Just do it. Like, what's all this talking about stuff? You know, and whereas another type like a 5 might want to research everything before they get moving. And to have compassion and to divvy up duties within a team that really account for the gifts of each type. And to manage that in a way where understanding is had about the value that each type's predisposition can bring collaboratively to community. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question. It looks like a lot of people love the question. And I also really appreciate when people who are social blind spots actively engage in community, because I know that it's not necessarily the default orientation. You know, it's sort of like, if sexual and self-pres are first, and you've got your partner at home with you, you're going to stay home for the most part. And to drag yourself into community takes a little extra work, or really happens as a result of starting to wake up to the breadth of your true needs as a human being, and to honor the reality of that which used to be a blind spot or used to be hidden. So I celebrate, especially when social subtypes become, or social blind spots become more active in community, because I understand how challenging that is, how it's not necessarily something you instinctively do, but it's something you stretch yourself to do, you know, in a way that can serve everyone around you. And are we at time? It looks like my laptop battery is, we're at 59. We have 45 seconds. Anyone want a final question before the battery of my laptop goes and such? Oh, and if you don't, I can read another one from here. How do stressful events in our lives, such as loss of job, loss of relationships, moving and death of loved ones, affect our day-to-day development? Hey, thanks. So yeah, in 45 minutes, I'll talk about how stress can affect our day-to-day development. So in the levels of development, I'll just do this very quickly. Again, hopefully this is just enough of a teaser that you want to research it on your own. So the idea is that Riso and Hudson really talked a lot about levels of development within your own number. And my understanding is that you can kind of go up and down within a day in a level of development. But, sometimes under high stress, you kind of like jump the whole quantum level, either down or up. Watching yourself, reading about the levels of development and looking at what your type looks like at a certain level is a good sobering experience, because most of us tend to think we're higher level than we are. But not using it to beat yourself up, but just using it as a point of awareness. What do you need to do? You need to ground in yourself. When you recognize that you're operating off a lower level, average or below, of your type. And so that's one piece. The other piece is, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the lines and watching yourself tap into one versus the other. If I know I'm going to my disintegration point of 4, then I might recognize that I need some additional support in finding grounding, in my own being. And so really using it compassionately to look at this map and go, oh my gosh, I'm all the way over here. I thought I was like up here on the mountain of spiritual development, but today really it's like I've fallen down here. And to just use that as an indicator rather than as a way of beating yourself up, to say, oh, that just means that I need this. And chances are it's not that you've actually forever fallen to that level. But applying deep compassion when you find yourself at a lower level is one way in which we sort of automatically rise up in consciousness and in peace. So it is 1 hour now. That was a long time. I'm so glad to see all of you here. It really heartens me, your interest in this. Glad to see your great responses, and maybe I'll do this again sometime, maybe not on a snow day. So blessings, everyone. I hope this served you, again, predominantly in gaining self-awareness, awareness of the fact that we don't all approach life in the same way, and to have deeper compassion for our differences, but also to recognize that there is a map home into our spiritual essence, into the core of our nature, that is that which can deeply feed us and in turn enable us to live a life and express love and goodness in a way that is organic, that isn't about shoulds, but is about something that naturally arises from knowing the truth of what we are, which I believe is love. So thank you, everybody.